All right, looking at chapter 17, it's going to cover World War I and the Russian Revolution. So your short answers for this chapter are: could World War I have been avoided? How did the new military technologies make warfare more destructive? Did the Allies lay the seeds for future problems in the peace settlement of 1919? And if you had been living in Russia in 1917, would you have joined the Russian Revolution? Here's your vocabulary. And the prelude to World War One. So all the things that were going on before World War One, which was at that time called the Great War. So the world on the eve of World War One. So in the 1900s, or early 1900s, Europeans were enjoying great peace and prosperity. No major war on the continent for a half century. Now it's just in Europe, but in other places in the world, there were a lot of problems that were going on. So in Turkey, what you see here with Mustafa Kemal, in Mexico, in China, and in Russia, you had a lot of different problems going on in those areas. So reformers, influenced by European ideas, were outraged at the sharp social divisions and authoritarian government. So what you had was a small group of people extremely wealthy, everybody else was poor. That's your social divisions. And then authoritarian governments, kings, queens, things like that. And in Austria-Hungary, that was the name for Austria after the compromise with Hungary in 1867. Different ethnic minorities dreamt of independence and establishing their own nation state. So Austria-Hungary is going to have a lot of problems right before World War One. And this is a good example of what Austria-Hungary looked like. And what you can see is all of the different ethnic groups that were in Austria-Hungary. So, and all of these groups pretty much all wanted to have their own country. So that would have pretty much just completely wiped out Austria-Hungary. So on the eve of World War One, unable to reform through moderate means, so in other words, like voting, things like that, some reformers turned to forming secret societies, secret revolutionary movements, things like that. So after 1900, different parts of the world exploded into social revolution. Russia, the Tsar was forced to create a national assembly, which is really what that is. National assembly is it's a type of government where the nobles could be elected and they could actually come up with laws and things like that. So the first time in Russia. In Turkey, the Sultan was overthrown in 1908. So here's a picture of the Sultan. And the Sultan would have been also a religious leader in Turkey. And in Mexico, you have the revolution that overthrew the country's military dictator in 1910. In China, nationalist reformers overthrew the emperor in 1912, so they got rid of the dynasty and they start their own government. And the powerful forces of nationalism and reform, which affected Russia, Turkey, Mexico, and China, had an equally explosive impact on the multi-ethnic empire of Austria-Hungary. So again, we talked about Austria-Hungary. So events in Austria-Hungary would bring the rest of Europe into armed conflict, and then eventually that would spread pretty much throughout the world. So the Great War, or World War One. Here's some of the different military technologies that they had at that time. So new technologies made warfare more destructive than ever before. And imperial governments and the old class system of Europe were eliminated. So, with the new technologies and the new ways of doing things, you end up having your imperial governments, which is where you go out and take over other countries, other lands, things like that, completely wiped out. So this is a tank. This would be a Zeppelin that was used to actually see enemy lines, people behind where forces were, things like that. Here's the cannons at that time, and the machine gun was a big one. Airplanes were used, but not as much as in World War II. And then U-boats or submarines start to come in. And of course, the big thing was poison gas, mustard gas, things like that. So the causes of World War I can be remembered as mania, so militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. So militarism is kind of what it means. The word is kind of explains itself. So this occurs when military values and goals take over civilian society. And at the end of the 19th century, societies had become more militaristic. So European countries tried to build up its own armies, Kings wore military uniforms, so that'd be like our president walking around in a military uniform all the time. And generals became influential in government. Germany and Britain competed to build the most powerful navy in the world. So anytime you have competition, you're going to have some problems happen. Military planning played a big role in the outbreak of World War I. Because it took time to assemble and move armies and railroads, so if it takes you a long time to get ready, you need to be ready at all times. Okay, so military leaders thought it would be better to attack first than to wait to be attacked. All right, and then you have alliances. So the A of mania. By 1914, Europe had become divided into two large alliances, which we see here. So Russia, France, Britain. And on the other side, you had Italy, Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria and Serbia kind of split between the two different alliances. You had the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And you had the Triple Entente, which was France, Great Britain, and eventually Russia comes in. So although these alliances sought to preserve existence and balance of power, they thought that they could balance each other out. What ended up happening was anytime you had a dispute, even a small one, everybody had to get involved. That was just the way they had planned it out. So here's your two groups. Here's the map, and really it's kind of showing how it happened. So you have a small dispute, another group comes in, another group has to come in and protect the other group, and that's how it ends up being a world war. And here are the groups again. Italy's kind of strange when they get out later on. But you see the problem that Germany's going to have. Okay, you're going to have two fronts here. You don't want to end up splitting your army in half and having to fight both ways. So nationalism. Nationalism is a belief that each ethnic group should have its own nation. Citizens of existing nation states that they should promote their own countries or their nation's interests and really not worry so much about world problems, things like that. That's why Trump, called himself a nationalist. He's more worried about American problems and things like that than world problems. So their own nation is superior to others. This is what gets a lot of countries in trouble later on. And nationalism encouraged rivalries between France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. So the spread of nationalism also led to the creation of new independent nations in the Balkans. And I'll show you where the Balkans are. So it's the areas around Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania, and Romania. All of them used to be part of the Ottoman Empire. They were given their independence, and they kind of tried to form their own countries, which sometimes is a bad thing because you just don't know what you're doing. So many of these new countries were unstable. And from 1912 to 1913, a series of local wars that threatened to involve larger powers broke out throughout the Balkans. Nationalism continued. So Austria-Hungary itself consisted of several different ethnic groups, which we talked about earlier. So they had Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Romanians, which becomes Romania, Poles, which is Poland, Serbs, which ends up being Serbia, and Croats, ends up being Croatia. All those different groups, really, those were some of the bigger groups inside of Austria-Hungary. Each one of their own nation state, and they threatened to break the Austria-Hungary Empire apart. And then the I part of mania, so imperialism, which we had talked about last chapter. So imperialism is the political and economic control of one state or people over another. So when Britain goes out and takes over a different country or a different piece of land, that's imperialism. So many European powers believe that the sign of great power was the possession of overseas colonies. So create a competition between European powers for the colonies in Africa and Asia. We talked about the scramble for Africa last chapter. It also led to competing economic interests. So different groups wanted to get to the resources in Africa, and again, once you compete, you cause problems between countries. So in the 1900s, 1/4 of the world was under the British rule. So Britain actually owned 25% of the land in the world in the 1900s. So German industrialization threatened British economic supremacy. and Russian interest in the Balkans threatened both Austria-Hungary and Turkey. So the Russians were trying to protect these Slavic people that were in the Balkans. And then assassination, the last thing, kind of what they call the powder keg, which actually set the whole thing off. In July 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian Empire, was assassinated by a member of a terrorist group called the Black Hand, which was a Slavic nationalist group which wanted to break away from Austria. And what they did was they assassinated the guy who was going to become the head of the Austrian Empire. So this is really what sets off World War I. So Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia. And remember, during the alliances, if one country has a problem with a different one, then their friends have to come in and help out also. So Serbia has actually helped some of these terrorists in this Black Hand group. So Russia entered the conflict to protect Serbia. So once Russia comes in, then France and Britain have to come in on the side of Russia. So Germany entered the war to fulfill its treaty obligations and to protect Austria. And finally, Britain and France came to honor their alliance with Russia. So the alliance system actually causes more problems than really what it helped out with. So what began as a minor regional conflict just in the Balkans had quickly escalated into a major European conflict. Italy stayed out. So Italy refused to join the Central Powers since Austria had been an aggressor. Austria had attacked first. They didn't feel like they had to uphold their contract with Austria. What ends up happening is the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, quickly comes in, and they join the Central Powers to oppose Russia, and while Bulgaria joined to oppose Serbia. So Bulgaria comes in on the side of Germany and Austria. And really, the Ottomans couldn't stand Russia. They've been fighting with them in the past, so they immediately came in and tried to help out the side of Germany and Austria. So this is what you end up with. Now you can see that Italy's out of it. These blue areas are actually neutral. They didn't fight at all. But these are your countries that involve Russia, France, United Kingdom, which is Britain, versus Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. So fighting the war. To avoid a two-front war, German war plans called for Germany to march through the lowlands of neutral Belgium and to take Paris quickly before the Russians can enter the war. So they want to wipe out France before they have to fight in both directions in a two-front war and end up having to fight Russia also at the same time they were fighting France. They advanced, but they were stopped right before they reached Paris. So when the war breaks out, President Woodrow Wilson actually called upon Americans to take no sides and remain neutral. So in this cartoon, what you have here is Wilson's trying to direct the ship in a very tough area, intervention. In other words, going into the war, actually get into the war. He's trying to stay out of it. Eventually, the United States is going to get on the side of France and Britain in the end.